Hello everyone, especially to students in the online master program Perspectives in European Crisis. I'm Ana Bojinovic Fenko from University of Ljubljana, and I will talk about the effect of European crisis on the enlargement process of the EU towards the Western Balkans. Now, the intention of this lecture is to make a short overview of the enlargement process as such and of the status of Western Balkan states within this process for the purpose of opening up a debate on what kind of effects the European crisis has offered, has caused to this process. We will look at this twofold. Firstly, we will look at what the challenges for Western Balkan states and the European Union are in the respective process, so accession process of the Western Balkan states to the EU. And then secondly, we will then point out some effects of the crisis. My main thesis is that the crisis has offered or has become some sort of an additional negative context for implementation of the accession process of the Western Balkan states towards the EU, and we will look at some cases of this de-Europeanization. The structure of the lecture is quite simple. We will firstly start with the actorness capacity which was built by the EU towards the Western Balkan states. Then we will turn our attention to the enlargement and the accession process as such. And we will try to conceptualize the accession process as a Europeanization process. And then, of course, out of that, to develop the de-Europeanization concept. And in the end, of course, we will look at the status of Western Balkan states in the EU enlargement as such, and the cases of this de-Europeanization which I have mentioned. The Western Balkans is a region in southeastern Europe, which probably all of you already know a lot about. But the most important fact is that this is not an obvious geographic, historical, political, economic, or any type of region which would be founded by the states of the area themselves, but it was founded by an external actor, or named even discursively. It came into being by the EU. It was coined by the EU itself. All right. So the Western Balkans, as formerly mainly area of the former Yugoslav Republic, made up of federal units. All of them except of Slovenia and adding Albania, and then we see all the other states from the region, so Croatia, Bosnia and Herzegovina, Serbia, Kosovo, Montenegro, and Macedonia. Now this region or this area has some recent historical context, which is their most important commonality, and that is, of course, that this is a post-conflict region, right? This, of course, means that many of these states are either entirely new states, which have never had any history of statehood up to when they were formed in the 90s or in the first decade of the 21st century. Or they did have some experiences with statehood, but in various and different forms, or in quite a long time ago, quite a few centuries ago. So basically, nation building, state building, and post-conflict resolution are the main issues in the area that are common to all states. Now, the EU started to deal with the region within the context of a politically geographical term, Southeastern Europe, which is much broader, which includes all Southeastern European states that are, of course, not member states of the EU, so it definitely excludes Greece. at the time, and the EU started to participate in a multilateral project called Stability Pact for Southeastern Europe. It was launched in 1999, but had been discussed quite some years before. And within this concept, the European Council summit in Vienna in 1998 forged a term, Western Balkans, and it actually named it as a region. So it started as a regional process towards this area which we have just defined, right? A regional in terms of EU's approach to the area. What happened later, which is very important, is that Zagreb summit in 2000 confirmed the so-called membership perspective for Southeastern European states, so for this larger continent of states. But 3 years later in Thessaloniki, the EU confirmed also a definite membership perspective for Western Balkan states. All right? So basically, out of this, the EU started to develop its stabilization and association process with the Western Balkan states as the initial stage or framework of cooperation between the EU and the Western Balkans region, which is aimed towards membership. And this is the so-called golden carrot that the EU uses in relations towards the Western Balkan states. Now, if we very briefly look at what these states, and of course any other state, has to fulfill to become a member of the EU, and you're all quite familiar with all these conditions for membership, we have the so-called formal conditions which apply to every potential member state, and then we have the other additional conditions which we call political conditionality. As for the formal criteria, we of course know, according to Article 49 of the Treaty on the EU, that a state needs to be European, it needs to respect and promote values of the EU in Article 2, and then, so this is the primary legislation of the EU, and then we have secondary legislation, which are basically 2 European Council conclusions from København and from Madrid, which are just altogether called København criteria, and we can look at them in detail over here. So basically, Article 2, the values of the EU: human dignity, freedom, democracy, equality, rule of law, respect for human rights, including rights of persons belonging to minorities. And then pluralism, non-discrimination, tolerance, justice, solidarity, and equality between women and men. As for the København criteria, this is the conclusions from København of the European Council. So membership requires that the candidate country has achieved stability of institutions, guaranteeing democracy, rule of law, human rights, respect for and protection of minorities. This is the political criterion. The existence of a functioning market economy, as well as the capacity to cope with competitive pressure and market forces within the Union, so the economic criterion. And, of course, the ability to take on the obligations of membership, including adherence to the aims of political, economic and monetary union, the legal criterion. Then we have the 4th criterion added in 2 years in Madrid, as said, the so-called administrative criterion. So the potential member state needs to form and have administrative structures which will enable it to act as a full effective member state. Now, if we look at the additional criteria that are called political conditionality, these pertain to individual potential member states, right? But in the case of Western Balkan states, they pertain to the region as a whole due to the fact, which I have just explained initially, that the area has been addressed as a region from the beginning. So, out of post-conflict resolution, the states need to additionally expose cooperation, full cooperation with the ICTY, with the International Criminal Tribunal for crimes committed in the area of former Yugoslavia, regional cooperation in the area, and then they have to deal with returning of the refugees and resettled persons. So basically it's about micro-regional cooperation in the area. So my point here is that all these criteria are not dependent only on the potential member state, on the applicant state, candidate state, whatever stage the state is already in, but it's relational. It has to do with other states in the region, which is quite demanding. And then secondly, the second area where more attention is put for the Western Balkan states is, of course, political transition. All these states, of course, were part of an area with a communist political regime and socialist central planned economies. So basically, and they are starting their statehood anew. And so building a state in terms of democratic institutions, rule of law, good governance, stable institutions, judiciary, and so on, this is all a big challenge for these states, and that's why it is especially pointed out by the relevant EU actors. Now, this political conditionality is implemented by various actors, not only by the EU as this undefined forum, but very, very concretely by, on the one side, the Commission, on the other side, the member states within the EU institutions, so basically within the Council, European Council, and thirdly, by the member states bilaterally, okay? And this is what we will look at in a second. Now, this is an attempt to very briefly sketch the accession process, all right? It has three phases, three stages, and they're the application, the negotiation, and the ratification phase, which are represented by the columns, right? And in each of those phases, the state, potential member state, has a different status: applicant, candidate, acceding state, okay? And here, in the left column, or basically the rows, represent powers that different actors have in the accession process. These powers, of course, pertain mainly to the EU institutions, but here we also have the EU member states, either within the European Council or bilaterally, as I said before. If we quickly go through the process, the potential member state, firstly, sends the application to the Council, right? The Council asks the Commission, the European Commission, to consult, so to an initial assessment of the preparedness of the state to enter the EU, and then the Council decides whether this application is in due form, and of course the Parliament has to give consent to the Council. All right? Now over here we already have a potential stage where individual member states, or of course the Commission in its initial assessment, can perform additional political conditionality, right? So some extra conditions need to be performed outside of the formal conditions which we have pointed out in the previous slide. After the state's application is accepted, confirmed by the Council, the state becomes an applicant state. Then the Council needs to confirm the candidate status of the state, and then the state starts negotiations. Confirmation of candidate status and start of negotiations used to be almost a simultaneous point for Central and East European states, point in time, I mean, right? But for the Western Balkan states, for some of them, this has become a real challenge. For example, one of them has been on this stage and waiting to start this one for 5 years. So this is a new dimension in this enlargement process towards the Western Balkans. Now, of course, the main actor during the negotiation phase is the European Commission, right? Because it conducts the negotiations, it does the screening, it proposes the yearly reports of the progress of the candidate state, and then in the end, every negotiating chapter needs to be closed. The closure of the chapter is the term, by the Council unanimously. So again, unanimously means potential reinterpretation of the formal criteria by introducing new political conditions or applied to the candidate state. After the candidate state has closed all the chapters, so after the harmonization of the formal criteria of the EU law has been achieved, plus after the additional conditions have been fulfilled, the Council is the one which confirms the accession treaty after, of course, it has been drafted by the Commission as the executive power or branch. And of course, we all know that the Parliament has this special role on giving assent to the accession treaty, and then ratification has to happen in all member states of the EU, and of course in the applicant acceding state. If we try to conceptualize this process, what we have seen right now, so the accession process, through the lens of a relatively new concept, maybe in use for 20, 15 years, and that's Europeanization, we can, of course, and the research community agrees, that accession process to the EU is an example of a top-down Europeanization. Now, what Europeanization means? Initially, it was forged as a concept within the policy analysis field. So, and it meant approximation of EU laws and values, norms, rules, and values, and its effects to national member states. So basically, it meant the influence of the EU level policies and processes on the national level of member states' domestic policies. Now, this concept has evolved a lot in those years that it has been forged, and it basically now means that not only domestic policies and political process is affected by EU level, but also foreign policies of EU member states are being affected by the, let's say, EU level, and also states outside the EU are being conceptualized within this Europeanization process. So how the EU affects states outside its respective membership constitution. Secondly, not only the actors and policies have been added to this concept, but also Europeanization has become a term which is used for denoting also national effect on the EU level, right? So basically not only top-down effects or so-called downloading, if we look from the point of view of the, let's say, receiving state, but also uploading, right? So bottom-up effects on the level of EU processes and policies. And then there is a third concept, cross-loading. But there's a lot of literature on this, and we are not going to use all this complex conceptualization of the Europeanization. We are simply going to look at top-down effects on the Western Balkan states. Now, in this context, what does then de-Europeanization mean? Okay, so we're looking only at top-down EU Western Balkan states effect. transfer of EU norms and values on, let's call it candidate states, despite the fact that they might be only applicant or not even applicant, so Western Balkan states. Firstly, de-Europeanization might mean slow progress in different phases of accession process, or even stalemate. This is something which I already kind of initiated before with the case of where 5 years a state did not move from one stage to another, right? So stalemate in transferring the acquis to national legislation. And of course, the causes for this stalemate may be on the side of the Western Balkan state, because it is not just doing enough of the national reforms, but it may also be on the side of EU member states, because they're the ones who interpret how the rules are supposed to be applied, and they may even apply additional conditions, right? So basically this is not a unilateral process. Okay, we have to download, we have to approximate our national legislation to the EU's, right? It's also on the side of the EU itself. You know the term enlargement fatigue, right? So you have promised the Western Balkan states that they will become member states, but what are you doing on your own side to make that happen? Secondly, de-Europeanization may also be a case of interpretation of EU norms and values, or member states' actions, which are in collision with domestic, so let's say Western Balkan states. Norms, right? So this is maybe looks complicated, but it's really not. Western Balkan states are still in the process of nation building, of identifying themselves who we are as a nation. And of course, we know this through relational theories, that basically a self defines itself through relations with the other. And this means relations in a sub-region, in the Western Balkans, relations with South Eastern Europe, and of course relations to the wider European region. And so sometimes the EU norms and values, which are something like a common sense to the EU community of states or EU citizens, is not something of a self-evident thing of the nation which is still being formed in the Western Balkans, right? We still need to relate to this new political, let's say, environment. And thirdly, sometimes, right, the actions themselves, so not only interpretation, but also actions. So this is like the gravest case of de-Europeanization. The actions of Western Balkans states denote breaking of EU norms and values. So they are in direct collision, and they break the EU norms and values. So basically, this is some sort of my interpretation of de-Europeanization. There's not a lot of literature on this yet, but it's being, of course, evolved. So we're still kind of getting to a consensus what this de-Europeanization means. But it has been definitely, it came out during this crisis, right? So, and it's also applied, of course, to member states, right? So that some member states have been practicing this de-Europeanization, which I will also come to in a second. If we quickly look at what the Commission and European Union member states have learned from the enlargement processes, basically from the Big Bang and then Bulgaria-Romania enlargement in 2007, for the case of the accession process of the first Western Balkan states, which has been successfully ended, of course, the accession of Croatia in July this year, I have prepared a very short comparison of additional political conditionality applied in the case of accession process of Slovenia, which you see the duration here, and for Croatia. All right? So the intention is not to go into detail into all these cases of additional conditionality, but it is to show that Slovenia had as much additional conditions posed by member states as Croatia, right? And that these are basically bordering member states of the EU, right? So for Slovenia, these were Italy and Austria, and for Croatia, obviously Slovenia, and also in the initial phase, Italy. What these states tried to achieve was to bring out some historically relevant, potentially open disputes, and Italy and Austria were, especially Italy, in case of Slovenia, was quite unsuccessful as long as it kept this issue as a bilateral issue, right? So, national border, status of Italian minority, a real estate ownership status of Italians who left Istria after the Second World War. These are issues that were brought up from the former relations between Yugoslavia and Italy tried to reopen them to get some more, some better national interest out of the issues. However, Austria, if I may say, was smart enough to bring its bilateral issue. Basically, it was the case of potential real estate denationalization, which was nationalized and thus taken away from former Austrian nationals living in Slovenian territory after, of course, the communist regime took over in Yugoslavia. They put this into the context of non-discrimination, right? Non-discrimination in terms of rights of buying property, and that is of course a language for the EU acquis, and denationalization needed to be pursued more actively and according to Austrian and then European Commission rules. So basically, the idea is to bring the bilateral issue within the European context of rules, right? In case of Croatia, these are quite similar, and Slovenia tried to do the same. So it kind of learned that it can bring up some open issues and make them perceived as of interest of the European community of states to be pursued and solved in the European way. So peaceful settlement of the border dispute and of the dispute over deposits, Croatian deposits in the former Slovenian-based Yugoslav bank. As for the Commission's side of additional conditionality, the thesis is that the Commission interpreted the rules, especially on the political criteria and legal criteria, much more meticulously for Croatia, because it already had experience with the Central and East European Big Bang enlargement, and of course with Romania's and Croatia's, Romanian and Bulgarian enlargement process, right? So basically, adding a special negotiation chapter, judiciary and fundamental rights, and applying it quite strictly for Croatia, of course, comes out of the initial assessment of Croatia's preparedness in this area, but also out of the experience of the Commission that this was a problem in reality, or it became a problem after some Central and East European states have become member states, right? Of course, these are then the regional political additional conditions which we have mentioned before, which apply to all Western Balkan states. Now we are moving to the part of the lecture, final part of the lecture, which will show more empirically the status of Western Balkan states in the accession process, right? This table, of course, with all these dates is for your information. The point of the table is to show the status of the state which has basically finished the accession process, of course, down to the state which has not even started it, all right? So we have all these phases, the three phases, okay? Application, negotiation and accession, but we have this pre-phase for Western Balkan states, which I have mentioned, the entrance into the stabilization and association process through the stabilization and association agreement. Now, this column shows the signature, and the second date is, sorry, I have missed this, ratification, right? So entry into force of the SAA agreement. And we can see that basically all states have managed to do this, except for Bosnia and Herzegovina. The ratification is passed in all the member states and in Bosnia, but due to, as we will see in the next slide, some differences in opinion and in interpretation of the progress of Bosnia in its constitutional reform, the SAA agreement for Bosnia is still not in force. So basically you can count more than five years, right? Until it's been signed. Commission is currently doing a study on the initial status of preparedness of Kosovo to enter the EU, whereas of course Kosovo also doesn't have the status of internationally recognized state, which complicates things in this case, of course. The two issues which I would like to point out basically are that from 2009 up to now, Albania has not been granted the candidate status yet. All right, so you can see the stalemate in this process. Something that used to be, after the application has been confirmed, used to be quite short time for example, Central and Eastern European states. And more so, this pertains to this date, right? When the candidate status of a state was confirmed and when the negotiations start. This used to be almost the same day for Central and Eastern European states. But in this case, we know that some member states are blocking the opening of negotiations for Macedonia out of let's for now call it national interest, right? So all these are cases of stalemate, right? This first concept of the Europeanization of Western Balkans states integration or accession towards the EU. In the end, I would like to expose some of the cases, or other cases also, of de-Europeanization of Western Balkans states. There's quite a lot of data here, but just for your information. For example, Croatia, already a member since 1st July 2013, has exposed or has shown some cases where it broke EU rules and norms, or one of them. That was, for example, in the case of non-respect for double language signs in Vukovar. Now, this is, of course, not a breach from the national government, but it is something that has to be understood as a context of nation building. People in Vukovar were very much exposed to and had a lot of casualties of the Croatian nationals in this area in their national war against the Serbian population. So they are very sensitive, emotionally sensitive, and the process of nation building in terms of Serbian language being equal in the area because of the minority right to the Croatian is still going on. So there is not to expect that just because Croatia entered the EU, all the population is fine with the fact that now some new rules are going to be applied in the area, right? Of course, we're not defending the fact that double language signs are being destroyed by I don't know whom, but basically they're being destroyed. But the fact is to understand this within the context of nation building. The second case, for example, is the so-called Lex Perkovic case. I have found out some concrete data about this. So basically, this law was passed only 3 days before Croatia entered the EU formally. So basically, only the signature, the entry into force of the, not signature, the entry into force of the accession treaty was awaited, right? Not de jure, but de facto, Croatia was a member already. Now, the law prevents authorities of the EU member states from extraditing, Croatian authorities from extraditing anyone suspected of a crime committed before 7th August 2002. Just that date. And the law is seen to protect a certain Mr. Josip Perkovic, a communist-era security chief accused of involvement in a political murder in Germany, and of course German authorities wanted to prosecute him. So we can see this is within the context of European arrest warrant law, which Croatia did not demand any exception or reservation from during the accession negotiations, right? So this is seen as some sort of reinterpretation of the application of the EU laws, right? Before it was a must, of course we need to download, but now that we are basically a member, we have the right to somehow reinterpret the law according to our interest, or interest of one special national, which again needs to be understood in this emotional or relational context of nation building. The case of non-respecting a bilateral agreement which was agreed with Slovenia just before Slovenian ratification of the accession treaty is a much more complex issue, so we're not going to go into detail of that, but basically it displays the fact that something which is understood as self-evident for European nations, which is to respect the treaties which we have signed, is not being applied here, right? So there are new contexts which are being raised by relevant also international actors here, because this is an issue pertaining to the succession of Yugoslavia, right? So basically, again, a potential deviation from, let's say, the way European nations practice their international relations. In case of Serbia, we can talk about that there are elements which are elements of that the Commission exposes as the stalemate in Serbia's progress towards opening negotiations, because Serbia has been granted the candidate status. And this is, of course, agreements related to dialogues with Kosovo, where, of course, the authorities in Kosovo are a different, let's call it international actor, than Croatian government. So again, this is a relational issue which doesn't depend only on the preparedness of the Serbian government, but of course is dependent a lot on it. Justice reform and independence of judiciary is being raised. Similarly in Montenegro, right? So we can see the formerly common state with similar problems of applying the democratic institutions, stable institutions, independence judiciary, and so on. And of course, regional cooperation with other states is being raised in case of Serbia, which again can be understood as a state building issue of Serbia. Serbia is not a really small state like all other states in the Western Balkans, right? It also has a different perception of itself, not only historically with all these narratives which you know about, but it's also geographically, physically a middle-sized state in the region, right? And it tries to achieve some sort of respect of this position. So probably it will apply regional relations differently than a really small, let's say Macedonia, for example, or Montenegro even, right? Again, we're not looking for excuses for these stalemates, but we're trying to understand them within the context of the state and nation building. As for Bosnia, it displays similar problems than Kosovo itself, because it is still very much physically trying to figure out how the state is to function better than it is functioning now, when almost everyone agrees that it's not functioning properly, but there is no either will or conditions for a better system. So basically, state building is still an issue, and of course the international involvement in the governance of Bosnia, as of course in the case of Kosovo, even more so. We have mentioned Montenegro, and here we can also add management of corruption as one of the biggest issues, biggest challenges of Montenegro, similarly as in Albania. And lastly, of course, but not least, Macedonia's stalemate. We have seen that Macedonia has been granted candidate status in 2005 and has not started negotiations up to now due to the prevention of this by Greece, and now also Bulgaria of their claims of the historical name to the geographical region of Macedonia and not the state of Macedonia. Now, for conclusion, as I evoked in the beginning of my lecture, the intention of the lecture is to raise not only questions, but to invite you to a debate, to a discussion on this issue, how the crisis has affected such a complex situation which we have exposed right now. My first point of discussion would basically be that within the crisis, either dealing with economic situation or with the situation of the crisis of governance, right? The EU level of governance, so EU institutions are quite unsure. So there is not a uniform answer to the problems which have been displayed in the either Eurozone or generally in the EU. Secondly, if good governance is under question within firmly established states, members of the EU itself, how can then EU advise the Western Balkan states the ways of applying good governance in their respective cases, when those states are in the form or in the being less than 10 years, some of them, right? Thirdly, the formal accession criteria, which are being additionally conditioned, of course, are sometimes, in some cases, not even respected by the member states themselves. If we look at stable institutions, right, sometimes independence of judiciary, especially problem in Eastern member states, or application of administrative structures which will make the member state an effective one, right, and so on. And finally, and this makes the debate, of course, much wider than only in terms of political analysis, if we talk about the political culture, we have been talking about Europeanization as a process of applying European norms and values and policies, so the political culture of the EU community of states, to the, let's say, national levels of respective states in our interest. However, this united in diversity within the EU, we have seen that it functions quite well if we look at culture in terms of cultural performance, art, music, literature, dance, and so on, right? So united in diversity, of course. But if we look at the application of political cultures in different member states, they also vary quite a lot. And this has been exposed by the European crisis, in my view, right? So the way that good governance is applied in member states themselves, a lot of different. I mean, the government lies to the EU authorities for years about its budgetary situation, right? So, is this the way of conducting EU rules and norms? So again, This basically means that not directly Western Balkans is affected by the crisis, because today, of course, you have seen we're not talking about any economic potential influences on the Western Balkans in terms of the pre-accession aid and things like that, but we're looking at the political context, right? So the legitimacy of the EU institutions themselves and of the member states, especially states in the region, right? So we're talking about neighboring states of the Western Balkan states, Bulgaria, Romania, Greece, right, are in question. So whom are we looking up to, right? This is a different debate than an interest-based debate that Turkey has been raising, right? What is our interest of becoming the EU member if the EU is not doing well economically, strategically, and so on? This is a totally different debate. Whom are we looking up to? Whom are we trusting that is going to help us solve our challenges? Right? So this is something to ponder about and to start your discussions. And I wish you good work in debates in your online program. Thank you.